I'm offering greetings to you from the Lincoln Theater Board of Directors and also from my staff here. The diversity, inclusion, and equity, fad or future. This topic was birthed from a conversation with Mo Wright and myself, along with our associates, and we agreed that on the heels of racial injustice being televised and projected locally and around the world, people of color are anxious to see if the actions and the statements of people and organizations about equity will truly remain consistent. It begs the question, is DEI a fad or a future? This community conversation will discuss how diversity, equity, and inclusion practices can remain sustainable and how local initiatives are furthering their work for long term. Our discussion will highlight the historical and contemporary challenges with DE&I initiatives and discuss the strategies to embed this work into the fabric of our community and its institutions. This 8-year program, Community Conversations of the Lincoln Theater, was designed to offer a safe but truthful space in which dialogue takes place to foster continued conversations and to encourage action for the betterment of mankind. And at this time, I just want to take the time to introduce you to my always relevant and always answer my phone call. My co-chair, he's the host of the WBCE Jazz. He's the director at the ODOT, and he's a historian of any subject, any subject. Dr. Jack Marchbanks, and he will set the stage for this evening's conversation. Jack?
Well, good evening, everyone. Good evening. It's so good. What a turnout. Wow, Susan. This actually is the 8th anniversary of Community Conversations. 8th anniversary. Back in 2014, we started the Community Conversation series with, of course, the blessing of the Lincoln Theater Board of Trustees. And we did our first series called Jazz to Hip Hop. Every generation has its music. And we've been doing it ever since, and the turnouts have been steady, and we thank you for being here and joining us for this important conversation. As Susan pointed out, I am a doctor of history. I got my doctorate in American cultural history from Ohio University. And the point I wanted to make before we delve into this rich and urgent subject is that history is a continuum. You can't put it in a box. You can't smother it. You can't say you don't want to see it. It's a continuum. And when you think about the continuum of African Americans in the United States of America, you have to go all the way back 157 years ago with the emancipation after the 13th Amendment. 4 million African Americans were freed, quote unquote, to go off and fend for themselves. 4 million. Imagine not having anything of your own, just the clothes on your back and maybe what you could carry. And you had to figure out how you were going to survive in a territory that had to be forced to free you at gunpoint by an entire army, a Union army. And for those of you who are African American, or you run into African Americans, you have friends who are African American, many of the people you see every day are descendants of that 4 million. Now, why are we talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion? When you talk about voting rights and all the other things that have been part of the disenfranchisement of African Americans over that 157 years, the thing that just grates at me personally the most is the intentional impoverishment of African Americans. Making sure they can't fend for themselves, making sure they can't, have a house over their heads or have equal pay. So diversity, equity, and inclusion is about economic empowerment. And what are the two main vehicles of economic empowerment in this capitalist democracy? Education and employment. And we've, as someone who's been around a while, I'm a griot, I'm elder, Susan. I've seen this thing called diversity, equity, and inclusion before. It's been called EEO, and it's been called affirmative action. So with that stated, I'm going to share with you a couple of video clips that give you that historical context before I bring up our august panel. Thank you.
Negro baby born in America today, regardless of the section of the state in which he is born, has about 1/2 as much chance of completing a high school as a white baby, born in the same place on the same day. 1/3 as much chance of completing college.
In far too many ways, American Negroes have been another nation, deprived of freedom, crippled by hatred, the doors of opportunity closed to hope.
Like most Americans, I don't believe that students should be treated differently based on their race. Hopefully, this case will end racial classifications.
Affirmative action began as riot control. Harlem was up in flames. Bed-Stuy was up in flames. Newark was up in flames. And if we don't do something to bring in young black people to the mainstream economically and educationally, we're not sure the society will hold together. The words affirmative action initially were attempts to deal with discrimination that African Americans faced in the labor market. There were executive orders by President Kennedy and President Johnson which said employers had to make a good faith effort to use affirmative action in their hiring and recruitment policies, which meant they were going to try to recruit people who had once been discriminated against.
I have some very sad news for all of you, and that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
After the assassination of Dr. King, there were riots in 60 American cities simultaneously. The leaders of the society, whether they were in government, business, or academia, said, this society can't hold together if black people are burning the cities. And they're burning the cities because they feel excluded. So we've got to bring them into our workplace. We got to bring them into our educational institutions. We got to let them feel that they have a stake in the society. It was a very effective response to urban unrest. Hundreds of thousands of people being hired by major corporations who wouldn't have been hired. You had colleges admitting large numbers of black students who previously only admitted a handful. It really changed the country. But it wasn't done because of a sudden burst of conscience. It was done out of fear that the society was falling apart. And when the fear passed, the sense of urgency about recruiting those large numbers of people started to dissipate as well. History is a continuum. That case that was referred to in the first video clip is in front of the Supreme Court now, and in fact, it was mentioned by Supreme Court nominee Ketanji Brown Jackson
in regards to whether or not she was going to rule on it when she becomes a member of the Supreme Court. It's now my great pleasure and privilege to introduce our moderator for this evening, Kiana Williams, VP of Total Rewards and Human Resources Operation with Ohio Health. I'd also like to bring to the stage Dr. Melissa Crum, Diversity and Equity Practitioner, Mosaic Education Network. Dr. Derek Tillman Kelly, Chief of Staff, the OSU College of Engineering. Dr. Wendy Smooth, Professor, the Ohio State University Department of Political Science. And my good friend and former Lincoln Theater Board of Trustee colleague, Dr. Marlon Moore, DEI Strategist and Consultant for Marlon Moore Consulting. Moderator Williams, you have the floor.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Good. So I'm so excited about this conversation. I've been thinking about it all week, and as Dr. Marchbanks talked about, about history being a continuum, I mean, we are obviously in a pivotal moment in history right now with the Supreme Court confirmation hearings. So, I kind of sprung it on my panelists that I do intend to go down that path tonight as well, even though I sent them some questions ahead of time that wasn't included in. So heads up, we are going down that path. But again, excited to have you all here tonight. And, doing this work, it's important to have common language. And so I really want to start with kind of setting the ground around the conversation that we're having and setting the stage for what we mean when we say certain things. So Dr. Marchbanks talked about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and in the field, we're starting to talk about belonging as well. And so I'd love to start by asking the panelists to establish these definitions. So let's start with diversity, and Dr. Tillman, you want to start there?
Sure. So when we tend to talk about diversity, we tend to be as broad as humanly possible. I'm situated at Ohio State, so we talk about all the dimensions of human diversity. But realistically, the easy and quick of it is that it's the things that sort of differentiate us. So it can be social identity. It could be the color of shirts we're wearing. It could be our eye color or hair. Right? It is about the ways in which we might categorize, connect, or differentiate people. But when we talk about it in the context of this, we tend to talk about the dimensions that tend to matter when we understand who and what we're ultimately attempting to do or serve.
Wonderful, thank you. And I am going to ask for a privilege because I am on the stage with 4 doctors, and so would prefer if I could call everyone by their first name. So is that okay? Please do. Okay. Wonderful. So Melissa, how about equity for you?
So equity is thinking about how do we give people what they need where they are. So when we're thinking about diversity, it's thinking about the identities that matter. So if you're female, if you're whatever your, whether it be race or socioeconomic status or region or nation of birth, all those things. And based on your identity, your access to English, whatever that might be, you might need different things. And so when sometimes people switch out that E for equality, and that means giving everybody the same thing. Well, everybody doesn't need software to ensure that you get all the communication needs you have for the office, right? Everybody doesn't need the same thing. So equity is being clear about what the groups that you are serving, what they need, and how do you reach them to meet those same success goals.
Wonderful, thank you. And Wendy, what about inclusion?
Thank you so much, and thank you for having us and sponsoring this amazing program this evening. When we think about inclusion, what we're doing is we're thinking about the actual bodies that are sitting around the table, the inequities that are grounded in historical circumstances. And we want to think about, when we bring people together at the table, are we creating conditions where people have an opportunity to equitably participate in conversations? And it's also about feeling a sense that you have a voice in your organization, that that voice is valued, and that, as Melissa shared, that you have the things that you need that will enable your participation. That's how I would think about inclusion, which I think is a very close cousin to belonging.
That's right, that's right. And Marlon, round us out, because belonging is a more new concept that organizations are thinking about. So ground us in what we're talking about when we say belonging.
Sure. And again, thanks to the Lincoln Theater for hosting this conversation. And thank you all for joining this panel. I'm pleased and proud to be a part of this distinguished group. So when I think about belonging, I view it as an outcome of the first three. So if there's representation, and you have that varied representation in the room, that creates this sense of inclusion, which fosters empowerment. Now I have a voice and I have an opportunity to make a difference. And then that leads to access or equity, being able to remove systemic barriers and create frameworks that make sure that there's equality. If I have all of those things, usually there's this sense of belonging. And when you feel a sense of belonging, that tends to really help create this level of authenticity where we can be ourselves, we can bring our ideas, we can share our thoughts, and we can do our very best in whatever that is. So I really see all three working together to bring a sense of belonging.
Yeah, that's wonderful. You know, one of the things that I was thinking about when Jack was talking again about history being a continuum is kind of the ebb and flow of diversity and inclusion. And so when you think about this work, where do you see organizations getting it right? So if you think about the four, D, E, I, and B, where are organizations getting it right? Derek, I'll start with you.
And then I laughed to myself. So I think in some ways, they're getting it right in all of the spaces, equally getting it wrong as well, right? And so what I mean is, if you look at the ways that folks, we are better able to talk about the diversity piece, right? Mm-hmm. We care about the percentage of our faculty, staff, and students who are women. Mm-hmm. We didn't a while ago, and right. it wasn't that long ago. We care about who are first generation or from low income or Pell eligible families, for example, mm-hmm. in higher ed. And yet we still often go out of our ways to ensure that the folks who had power, who set the conditions, still decide how many of those folks mm-hmm. are invited and usually where they might find their seat. And so I think you can say we're getting it right across the spectrum while equally critiquing the ways in which we spend a lot of time focused on diversity and often fail more regularly in the equity, inclusion, and belonging space.
Absolutely. And so, Derek, that's a picture of what's happening in higher ed. Marlon, you spend a lot of time in corporate America. Talk about where they're getting it right.
Yeah, so I think there's a heightened awareness, but I would caution us to think about where that comes from. So in the video, it talked a lot about affirmative action. And when I think about affirmative action, while beneficial to many marginalized groups, that promoted this sense of compliance. Mm-hmm. Okay, I'll check the box. Good faith effort. I went out and I tried to find someone who was Black or Hispanic. That's not sustainable. Mm-hmm. So what we need to really do better at, while we have awareness, which is great, is focus on what intrinsically motivates us as individuals and as organizations to do better and understand why that matters. When we understand that, then we begin to build a more sustainable approach going from compliance to competitive advantage. So you can have awareness, but if no one really knows why they're doing it and they can't articulate the benefits of it, then it won't last. Yeah. So I really appreciate the awareness, but even with awareness, to be sustainable, you have to move from compliance to competitive advantage.
Yeah, absolutely. So Melissa, your consulting practice works a lot with community organizations, arts organizations, and so sometimes those organizations think about DEI and be slightly different from education and corporate organizations. So talk about what's happening in that space and where folks are getting it right.
So I think I like to think of DEI in these kind of two camps. People are either like head-led, which is that competitive advantage. How does this help my bottom line? Even though they're nonprofits, you still got to pay the bills, so you still got to care about the income, right?
Absolutely.
And then there's the heart people who are like, it's the right thing to do, it's social justice, like so that's great. But you got to have both. You got to have both. And so nonprofits tend to lean into the heart space more than any other place and not really thinking about how do I ensure that even though I'm getting this pipeline of more diverse folks, and we're happy you're here, but not necessarily thinking about should we be questioning or critiquing or looking through the policies and practices that we have. What is our workplace culture? Because at the end of the day, we're saying a lot of things, we're saying all the right things, but you want more women, but you don't have a maternity leave policy. Not that every woman wants to have children, but right now we're the only humans that can make more humans. Mm-hmm. So you should probably have a policy around that. So you can't invite them and then you wondering why they're leaving because you haven't set the table for them, right? And so I say, you're inviting people into a burning house. And you're wondering why they're coming and they're leaving. It's like, well, they come up with all the reasons, right? Well, maybe they just weren't ready. Maybe I thought that their education was enough, their experience was enough. But you're not paying attention to what you actually were inviting them into, and people don't want to take a hard look at changing the culture because that means you got to do something different. Absolutely. And people oftentimes want to talk the good game, but don't actually want to think about, I probably need to lead differently.
Well, and I think that, excuse me, I think this is such an important point, especially when we think about kind of the state of DE&I, is that a lot of times we think about it's just getting people in the door, right? Marlon talked about that. Melissa, you just touched on it, but it really is thinking about everything that's happening in the organization, the policies, just like you said, whether or not people really feel like they belong, all of those things. So let's talk about, what is the state? Right. I think that there was a fever pitch, right, over the last summer, right, unfortunately driven a lot by, the murders of Black people. And so, you saw companies putting black boxes, on their Facebook pages, so on and so forth. But you started to see another wane, right? So where are we right now? Are companies still doing the work? Wendy, I'll start with you.
Great. Thank you. One of the things that I always talk with people about is that DEI work is the long haul work. It is not simple solutions. It's not check a box. It's not change one policy. Because the magnificent component of this work is that once you understand the structures that underlie inequality, that prohibit a sense of belonging, that uphold unjust systems, you start to see that if it's impacting one particular group in a particular way, and you start to understand the structure of, say, racism in your organization, once you have a sense or an understanding of how racism is in operation, it leads you to ask an additional question. As a really great legal scholar, Mari Matsuda, has trained us to ask the additional question. So if racism functions this way in my organization, what is happening with sexism? What is happening with homophobia? What is happening at the intersections of race and gender and homophobia in my organization? So it's not short-term work. When people ask me, what can I do? I'm ready. Like, all right, you're ready? Let's go. And I need you to bring a bottle of water along because you will get thirsty and tired along the way. I think when we accept that it's a learning process, that it's ongoing. We can take advantage of what I think of as these moments of opportunity where there's great energy. I'm trained as a political scientist, so we call them policy windows of opportunity, right? Where we have a big surge time where we can really get a lot of things through. But at the same time, you understand that there will be other major crises, issues that arise, that window will begin to close. And you have to have important critical actors at the forefront who are determined to keep a crack in the window, right? And those are the people who have invested in the long game approach of diversity work.
Yeah,
Can I add to that?
Please.
So one of the things that I found in that surge, because if you are a practitioner, then everybody's calling you after George Floyd, we need a workshop. And it's like, okay. But they don't know how to necessarily connect what was going on with let's say police brutality, what's going on there, to them in accounting or them as a people leader. And so like what Wendy is saying, how racism works, we kind of see it as, oftentimes people see it as people being mean to each other. Like Derek Chauvin just being like a terrible human being and not thinking about what were the practices and policy that allowed him to be that, and that was not his first time, right? Knowing like what was the culture of the space that let him believe that it was okay? What was the policies that continued to let him not be accountable? Now, how do you transfer that into your space? So for example, Harvard Business School came out with this research around black employees disproportionately are scrutinized more than their white counterparts. And they're doing the same mistakes. So what they're finding is people leaders tend to watch their people of color more. Now, how does that look systemically? Well, if I'm looking at you more than your white counterpart, y'all making the same mistakes now. Now you don't get put on that project. Now you don't get promoted. Now you don't rise up in the ranks. And you're like, I wonder why the people of color aren't rising up in the ranks. Well, that's how racism is operating in your space. But until you have things like systems set up like one-on-ones and feedbacks and performance reviews, and people know how to give feedback, and people know how to evaluate in healthy and productive ways, then you won't know that actually those two are having the same issues. You as a manager need to be trained on how to give people feedback, and you need to figure out what are the ways you can give both of these people the skills so they don't keep messing up, because that's compromising your output, whatever that is. And so we don't think about how these systems that aren't necessarily directly connected to race or identity or things like that, how they actually help all of those things. And so we don't really we aren't taught to see race as systemic or institutional. We see it as people burning crosses or people calling people names, and it's full stop. And it's like, it's way bigger than that. And people who are perpetuating racist acts within their spaces are probably the nicest sounding people. Like, they're probably very caring folks. But they are not necessarily seeing how they're participating in a system of oppression.
Well, and I think this is such an important point, and I kind of heard the audience sounding like a Black Baptist church saying amen. Passing the offering plate just now. But, you know, I think this is such an important point because it goes back to the idea of, you know, whether or not we have bias built into our systems, our policies, so on and so forth. And so to me, this is really, you know, ties to the question of where is the state of the work right now, right? Because we've moved past, to Marlon's point, we've moved past compliance, you know, we've moved past just getting butts and seats. We really have to do that harder work, right, of, you know, completely dismantling systems. And so how do we do that, Marlon? How do we get to that place?
Yeah, so one of the things that I found refreshing, because I'm a former chief diversity officer, started Marlon Moore Consulting 2 years ago, right in the midst of the unrest. And I was, initially I was nervous because most of my calls, while I was thankful for each and every one of them, a lot of them were about training. Mm-hmm. You know, and it's like,
train us not to be racist anymore.
You know, training it's a part of it. What I'm encouraged by is a lot of the calls I'm getting today is for more strategy. So that's the next evolution. So develop your statement, what's important, why is it important, who's responsible, but then move to action. So to break down these systems and by moving to action, again, we're saying where are the gaps? What's wrong? What do we need to improve? And so in developing a diversity, equity, inclusion operating plan, you're coming up with strategic objectives to help you better your organization. You're aligning those with key initiatives that will help you achieve your objectives and to sustain the work and make sure everybody buys in and it's not just a Marlon Kiana gig. There's this shared accountability piece where your key performance indicators become paramount. That's what keeps everything together. So, I think if we're going to sort of break down those systems and promote sustainability of the work, you have to have a strategic plan. No matter, how big or small. I say in my book, Diversity Starts With You. Don't try to boil the ocean. Right. Okay, we're going to have 10 strategic objectives and we're going to get the award of the year for diversity. No, it's too hard. The work is too intense. So come up with a plan with objectives that move you in the direction you want to go.
Can I just add? So one of the things that I find really interesting is that we'll bring in a consultant, we'll say, we want you to do this DEI project over there, right? But we're not linking it to the core elements of our enterprise. So at The Ohio State University, if we're doing diversity work and we're not linking that to the curriculum, if we're not thinking about how that is going to change the kinds of students that we bring in the door, the faculty who are in front of them, the ways in which we interact with major funding agencies, the ways in which we look at our graduation rates, everything across the enterprise has to also be engaged in the conversation of DEI. Otherwise, we start to think about it as that, oh gosh, something extra that we have to do, as opposed to seeing it as germane to the work that we do everywhere and germane across the enterprise. And that is, I think, the sustainability piece. Because if I have to think really critically about how I hire, how I recruit students, and how DEI has to inform every aspect of that work, it has more staying power because you're getting more hands in the pot. You're having more people become those true believers that we need as champions for DEI. And we're also not putting DEI work out on a limb that could easily be cut off at any moment when we are in moments of austerity, where we're trying to make ends meet, and then DEI can't meet. We have to figure out the ways that we weave it into everything that we do, or we fail at that important sustainability question.
Yeah, can I get just really quick? I want to give a real example, and this borderline shout out to you and your organization. How many people in the audience and on this stage go to the doctor or have gone to the doctor? Raise your hand by show of hands.
I hope everybody.
Okay. So, and when you go to the doctor, just kind of shout it out. What are one of the things you think about or care about the most?
Blood pressure, heart.
All of that, or patient care. Yes. Patient care. So recently I tore my shoulder, the second one, had a rotator cuff surgery, and I don't like hospitals. I really cringe when I have to go to the hospital, okay? So I'm going to the hospital, I'm getting ready for surgery, and then I had to go under. That makes me even more frightened, okay? So I'm frightened coming in, I'm frightened probably coming out. So I go into the hospital, and immediately there was this sense of calm, and I couldn't quite figure it out, so I'm paying attention, and the first thing I noticed was the environment. It was very calming from what was on the wall, the music that was playing, the seating. Then it was the people at the desk. Good morning, Mr. Moore. So happy to see you. Looking forward to a wonderful experience today. So now I'm loosening up a little bit. And then they rolled me back. The nurse was phenomenal. What do you want to watch on TV? Well, we're only going to have you in here for a few minutes. And then the anesthesiologist came in. And one of the things he said to me as they took me back was, I'll see you on the other side. We're going to take good care of you. What was the common thread in all of that? I felt included. The representation mattered. The woman nurse was Hispanic. The anesthesiologist was a black man. And all of those things working together, including my doctor who did a phenomenal job, I must say, made me come out feeling better. And I would highly recommend anybody who had to have that procedure go see Ohio Health. They took care of me, and that's why this matters. All I'm saying to you all is when we leverage the benefits and the power of diversity, you get better outcomes. Yeah, right. And I'm here to say that my experience in a very trying time, I directly correlate to that staff.
Well, so first of all, on behalf of Ohio Health, I'm glad that that was the experience, right? So Marlon and I did not talk about that. But to both the point that Wendy and Marlon are making, we were intentional in our strategy. So when our diversity and inclusion strategy, we call it 5 Ps. So it's people, that's our workforce. It's providers, right? So it's, do our providers provide a culturally competent experience regardless of who the patient is, right? Because we want a for-all experience. It's patients, right? The heart of healthcare is our patients. So how could we have a diversity and inclusion strategy absent of our patients? It's places. So thinking about where we're planting new facilities. Are we increasing access? And then finally, it's partners, right? And that's supplier diversity work, so on and so forth. So to everything that you've heard here, right? A lot of times when people think about diversity and inclusion, they just think about the workforce. For us, it had to be everything. Melissa, I think you were going to get in.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, what people don't do is operationalize their values, right? So when you say people, what does DEI mean in delivery through people? What does it mean as delivery through places? I know that's not necessarily values, but let's say if your value is like integrity. So I had like a client that would have these like vague values like kindness. Okay, what does that mean? Like, what does that look like? What are the behaviors that are connected to that? And if you can't articulate what those behaviors are and how they align with DEI, then what are you measuring? And then how are you giving people feedback at the level of kindness in connection to whatever it is that you do? And then also to Wendy's point, if you can't understand what DEI means to you in your role, then it will feel like this extra thing because you don't know why you're doing it. And you don't know how it's going to help you get to whatever your department end goals are or what your team goals are or whatever it is. And oftentimes, too often, the people who are calling, they don't even know what they want. They just know they want something to be better and they want nobody to call them sexist or racist or homophobic. That's all they know. Just don't say that we homophobic. And so just like, can we do this thing to say that we're not? And it's like, okay, well, that's cute. Also, you're still doing the things still. Like whatever those things are, you're still doing the things. And so when we start having to think about strategy, that means you likely have to change something. They likely have to do something that you're uncomfortable with. And oftentimes I have to tell people just because you're uncomfortable doesn't mean you're unsafe. Just because you're having a hard conversation doesn't mean something is coming to get you. That just means you're not used to talking in this way or having this conversation. You're not going to die. That just means you have to think through what does it mean to talk about why is it hard for you to give. For example, I'm on feedback because it's been the constant thing right now that people do not give feedback. So there, I had this one client he was a supervisor, and he would not give his female direct reports critical feedback because he was scared they were going to cry. Some of them did cry. Okay. That doesn't mean you shouldn't give them feedback. So then what happened was those women would not know what they needed to fix. They wouldn't know that they needed particular types of training. And then one of the objectives of the organization was for women to rise in the ranks. Well, they can't rise if they don't know what they're not doing right. And the men were not giving the women feedback, right? And so just because you're scared or uncomfortable doesn't mean, and you got to think about what are the consequences of that. And people don't necessarily think of that as how sexism is operating, but ultimately that's what's happening. So what too many organizations don't do is operationalize their values, say what are the behaviors that are connected to it, connect it to a system or a strategy that measures that, and then bring a through line from the top to the bottom of what DEI looks like. And that last part, part of DEI is accountability. And so oftentimes we have all the PIP plans for all the people who are managers and below, but when the CEO screw up, he don't have no PIP plan. Right? You get to tweet sorry and then you're done. But you don't have, what does accountability look like throughout? So when I say, well, yeah, it's nice that you want to hire more people of color and those things, but what if the CEO mess up, what is that strategy? Where is that in the handbook? Because a big part of DEI is accountability. Like, oh, we weren't really thinking about that. We just wanted you to tell us that we were doing great. Well, I can't, because we don't.
Right.
We need some systems in here.
Yes. So one of the things that I want to do, because I think a lot of times, when, we're in mixed company, right, we have an opportunity to really talk about what that experience is, right? Like, why do we need it? And I think we've articulated, it's more than representation, right? It goes back to the point where I said I heard the amens, right? Because you were talking about what people's real life experiences are. So that's kind of what I want to do for a little bit, is talk about kind of the why behind D&I, right? So getting beyond this is, an economic something or a hard something, right? Like, let's talk about the real experiences that people of color are having in organizations. And one of the things that triggered that for me was in the video where it talked about affirmative action, and I felt like the moderator was intimating that, affirmative action, like, open the floodgates for all these Black people to run through the organizations. And I'm like, affirmative action mostly benefited white women, right? And so, again, it's really important for us to be honest about these experiences. And so when we talk about the experiences of people of color in organizations, how would you articulate where organizations are getting these things right and where we still have opportunities? Derek, I'm gonna start with you.
So one of the places I think you can determine how well you're doing is by looking at your HR organization. Sorry.
It's all good.
If your HR organization is all white women, I can guarantee you the organization's not right. And here's what I mean. When you talk about the ways in which society interacts with folks, what we know is that white women tend to get a level of privilege and grace, I'll use grace, that allows them to do things that often, if a Black woman did it or a man of color did it, it wouldn't be tolerated. And so then when you get into a structure where everybody who is meant to hold folks accountable, who's meant to grow the workforce that you have, all come with a very similar situated lens of the world, you end up in spaces where we often find that most folks can't find a natural path through the organization. And it's often because it's passive aggressive, not because people are outright disrespectful or rude. And so I think that's one of the spaces where I struggle with our organizations, because HR is predominantly white women, and it is often the passive aggressive arm of our organizations that allow mistreatment, harm, and ultimately allows for us to say that the organization has been progressive because, look, all these women are guiding us. But no one asked the question of what did the women consist of, because they often are one demographic when you talk about racial. And yes, some of them may be queer. That's fine too, right? As a queer man of color, a gay Black man, I understand the ways those dimensions come into play. But when you look at the where people are situated, right? The fact that HR can easily be described as a white woman's place tells us one of the ways in which we've sort of defaulted to assume that because women show up, right, that it is a different kind of organization. And the reality is, if you look at history of race and racism, women have been, in most places, the biggest empowerers or enablers of that system to continue.
So this is I heard some amens over there too from the brothers, okay. So Wendy, I think what Derek is really kind of getting us into is the subject of intersectionality. So let's start by defining intersectionality, and then let's talk a little bit about it.
Sure. So when we think about this concept of intersectionality, which is great to hear us just on a regular panel in the community raise the phrase intersectionality, because 15 years ago, you say that term. I remember watching a CNN story during the 2008 presidential election, and it was like, intersectionality? So it's wonderful that we're talking about it in this way. So just as a short kind of definition, when we think about intersectionality, we want to think about identity as not, and systems as not being singular in their histories and their lived current expressions of operation as being singularly defined as about racism or about sexism or about homophobia. Intersectionality encourages us to look at those systems as interlocking and thinking about the way that the systems are what we call co-constitutive. And that just means that they are in operation at the same time, that they are feeding one another as they are being developed and enacted, so that you can't have sexism without racism, and you can't fully understand sexism without understanding racism as a co-constitutive, as a co-created process. It also means that it's okay to think in complexities. It's okay for us to name HR as being predominantly white women, and it's okay for us to, at the same time, think about how HR is the most disempowered element of our organizational structures and systems. Sorry. Right?
No need to apologize to the HR lady.
You know, and when we look at our organizational charts and we see the success of women and people of color and our GLBTQ colleagues rising in our organizations, and they're rising in HR and DEI only, that also is a problem. Right. That's a systemic problem, because we're understanding that as those people's problems. Yeah. Right? And we're not, again, allowing DEI to infiltrate every aspect of the enterprise, because we should have development officers who represent diverse experiences. We should have, people from all across the enterprise as guiding and leading from a space of intersectional perspectives. Now, the other piece, let me just say this about intersectionality. They really gets me. Intersectionality was founded out of a concern for the ways in which African American women were experiencing the workplace. That our current, and Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality, but we can go through a number of different scholars across time who were participating in articulating these experiences. But when we look at the history of intersectionality, we were looking at the ways in which, if we only looked from a race perspective, we weren't quite understanding African American women's experiences with disempowerment in their workplaces. If we looked at the experience of gender, we weren't quite able to understand African American women's experiences in the workplace. And it is really at these points of intersection that we understand the unique and different experiences of those who are multiply defined by our systems of power. And I would always make, and so to this point, when you disconnect intersectionality from power and power analysis, it's no need to speak of it. You have disempowered it to a point that it is meaningless. So when you tell me that a white middle-class man is an intersectional identity, I'm not having it, because what we're attempting to do with this concept of intersectionality is to name the ways in which the complexities of identity actually breed and create new ways of disenfranchising and disempowering people in our workplaces and in our communities. So we can't understand it without power.
Can I give a workplace example?
Please do.
Yes, okay. So adding to a story that Dr. Crenshaw illustrated, there was a case of Black women who were working in a automobile company. And they were suing their company for employment discrimination. And they were saying that they were discriminated because they were both female and black. And what was happening at this auto company was that if you were a man, if you want to be hired in the factory, they were hiring men. And if you wanted, but mostly, what was all men. And if you wanted to be in administration, they were hiring women. But if you wanted to be in administration, they were hiring white women in particular. And if you were in the factory, they were hiring a lot of black men in particular. So where do you go as a black female? Your blackness should allow you to get into the factory, but your femaleness is keeping you from that. Your femaleness should allow you to get into administration, but your blackness is keeping you from that. And so intersectionality is saying, I'm not just a woman, I'm not just a black person, I am both black and female. And so because of these multiple identities, it's creating a barrier. And so they end up, I believe they lost that case because the way laws is set up, they looking at one direction at one time. And so the automobile company ended up winning that because they say, well, they're not being racist because they are hiring black people, but they were hiring black men. And we're not being sexist because we're hiring women, but they're only hiring white women. And so intersectionality is saying we have to look at multiple identities at one time. And intersectionality is also a critical race theory component.
Well, and the other thing that, I think that, we should think about when we think about intersectionality too is all the conversations that we're having in organizations around pay equity, right? And so when we talk about pay equity, you often hear about the gender wage gap, right? And if you stop there, right, then black women, Native women, Hispanic women don't get the bump that they need as well, right? And so this is, actually impacting people's pocketbooks as well. So, when we think about intersectionality, right, it's in a number of different forms. And so I know that, we're going to be opening it up for questions from the audience here in a second. So just a few more questions for the panel. And so as promised, I do want to kind of pivot to current events because I do think that if we think about the confirmation hearings, they really do give us a lens into what people are experiencing every day in the workplace, right? And so if you think about Judge, because I've already put her on there.
You claimed it is so.
If you think about Justice Brown Jackson and the fact that she's actually in an interview process right now and how this interview process is unfolding for her is what we often hear from people of color about what interviewing is like. So Marlon, can you talk a little bit about what we can learn from a D&I perspective with respect to what we're seeing unfold for her?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I'm going to speak from it, as she would say, from my lane as an African-American male. But the thing that gets me that I don't want to get lost in this is our president committed to ensuring diversity, an African-American female on the Supreme Court. That matters. And here's why. If any organization says we're going to grow revenue by 25%, what do you think they're going to do? They're going to work to grow that revenue by 25%. When the President of the United States committed to that, it became so. He had to follow through. Why? Because there's a level of accountability associated with that. Now, I will say this. I don't agree necessarily with the approach that he took. I would have communicated it differently. I like what he did. But I do think in some regards, there were some groups that were left out. They're represented, but there's a way you have that conversation. So said differently, rather than saying, I'm not going to look at anyone else, I'm just going to hire an African-American woman, you can say, we're going to appoint someone with a focus on ensuring representation that is not currently there. That's just my particular D&I philosophy. That being said, I appreciated him for saying he was going to do it and sticking to it. And what I love the most is he could not have chosen a more qualified judge. Not black, not woman. He chose a bona fide candidate. And the thing that I'm taking away from just the 4 days that I've watched is this thing called resilience and perseverance. Because I literally, yesterday, I watched it and I said to myself, why don't she get up and walk out and say, y'all can have this? Like, you just be done with it. Just get out of there, like, to hell with it. And I was like, Marlon, you know she can't do that. But just the grace and confidence that she exuded, I'm encouraged by witnessing that. And so I can't speak to what it's like for black women to have to endure some of the things she endured. But what I know is any of us who spent some time watching that are all better from watching her be strong through the face of very, very unfortunate questioning and character attacks. And so I'm encouraged because I saw how it was done or how it should be done. And I'm also encouraged because there was a level of commitment that was made, that was honored. And that I think if we're going to move the needle, there has to be accountability. That's the last thing I'll say, you all. We have to hold businesses and institutions accountable for not doing it right. Until we demonstrate that, you know what, if you're not going to give us what we require, good patient care, loans, education, we're not putting our money into your institutions. Why would someone change when there's no impact or consequence? And so while building strategy and changing systems is important, but there's a role that we all play at the individual level too, to hold organizations accountable. So
thanks, Marlon. Melissa? I saw you feverishly taking notes, honey.
So many things. So first, I do think it's important to be clear about if you want particular identities in a space. If you're able to do that. Now, I mean, no, you get that. But I think it's important to recognize that. For example, when we talk about race, how race was defined in the United States came out of the Supreme Court. Specifically, how we define whiteness came out of the Supreme Court. So what would it have looked like if we didn't have all white Supreme Court justices that said, oh, we need to define whiteness in this particular way and infuse it in our laws in this particular way? I think that would make sense to say, hey, we should probably not have all white Supreme Court justices really shaping how we're thinking about race and laws. That would mean something. So I think we should be clear on that. And I think we got to figure out that that's okay to say that's what we need in this particular space, but you need to be able to articulate why. And I think that's important. The other thing, sometimes, too often, we confuse or we think if we have DEI goals, we're compromising quality. And so I'll hear a supervisor or a hiring person say, well, should we say we want a qualified minority candidate? I said, do you say you want a quality white candidate? Do you say that? Like, no, you don't say that. You automatically assume that they would be if you hire them. So the fact that you have to say, that you feel like you have to say, if you have DEI goals, you have to say you need quality, you are presuming that diversity means lack of quality. And now I can imagine how that's showing up inside your workplace culture. Talk about inclusion and belonging. So if you already have that assumption, again, very kind, nice hiring managers, yet and still, we can imagine how that's showing up. I think the last thing is when we're talking about interviewing, I think first, people aren't trained to interview. Start there. Also, I think it's important to be thinking about how are your interviewing questions behavioral and connected to the actual work you'll be doing. Like, for example, and I'm not the political scholar, Dr. Smooth is, but help me if I'm correct, Supreme Court justices don't offer sentencing, right? They don't sentence, is that correct? Kind of?
No, they don't.
Okay, so Lindsey Graham, right, was like, I'm questioning her sentencing.
He Lindsey, though.
Right. But it's just like, I'm questioning her sentencing background and how, but she don't sentence as a Supreme Court judge. Like, why are you even bringing that up? And so thinking about when you're having these when you're interviewing, stick to what they're actually doing. Really think about behavior questions, asking them how would they operate in this particular capacity if they had these situations, if they had these challenges, and let them answer from there. And I think people don't do that enough.
Well, or I don't know about the role of a Supreme Court justice in children's books, right? So, I mean, so, you know, Ted pulled out the children's book, right? So, yeah. Or Raphael Cruz.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
A Canadian.
A few things. So one of the things that I think we as the American public should take as the teachable moment in these hearings is to a point we talked about earlier. All eyes are on Judge Jackson Brown. I invite you to look at the behavior of those who are doing the questioning, right? We have to look at the processes that they are using for evaluation. We should be looking at the tone and the temperament and the assumptions of those who are doing the questioning. Because we are in a moment of making history. We are living history. And all of us have an opportunity to participate in the living of history. When we were down this road once again and a black woman was sitting before the Senate Judiciary Committee, this time in the embodiment of Anita Hill, right? We were in a teachable moment. We had a lot of learning around what it means to live the experience of sexual harassment in the workplace. We came out of that moment with a nuanced workplace language around sexual harassment, and that was incredibly important. But also out of that moment, in 1992, we elected more women and women of color to Congress than at any other time in our nation's history. And that was in part because at that time we only had 3 news channels, NBC, CBS, and ABC, and everyone had to watch the hearings. And out of that moment, people were appalled at what they saw in terms of the questioning. And women, like never before, decided, I need to be a part of this institution. And they entered, and that's the class of Maxine Waters and those folks who entered at that moment. I think we have a very pivotal moment of holding people accountable as voters as we're watching this particular hearing take place. The other thing that two other pieces I want to uplift, and this is about the kind of idea of naming who you would like to fulfill the position. And this goes back to accountability. President Biden was being accountable to black women voters who helped to get him elected, right? Right. Thank you, Dr. who got him elected. And that is what we do in politics. So one of the things that we have to do is we have to normalize for people of color what we do for other Americans, right? So when other interest groups have been profoundly important in electoral politics, we recognize their significance and importance. So, again, another history lesson. Ronald Reagan appointed the first woman to the Supreme Court, and he announced ahead of time that he was going to do it. And one of the reasons why he was going to do it is because he could see the uptick and the rise in women voting in the country, and he was interested in endearing them for the long term to his political party. Joe Biden is doing nothing different by naming that he would name an African-American woman. And politics works a little bit different than some of our private institutions and our public education institutions. But I'll close and say this. I was going to say justice. I wore my T-shirt today because we were talking about diversity. And Judge Brown Jackson said, they were asking her about kind of the historic moment of being the first African-American, blah, blah, blah. And she said that representation matters. And she talked about the little girls who've been writing and thinking about the law differently. Beautiful response. But the most powerful thing she said is that representation matters because it instills public confidence in our institutions. We are more confident. Your visit to the hospital. You were more confident in your experience because of the ways that you felt included. Oftentimes, we make the business case for DE&I, right? And we think about the bottom line and all of that. But we also have a different dimension of accountability that we can pay attention to. And this is this idea of public confidence in what we are doing, workplace confidence in the work that we are doing. When people are represented widely, you instill greater confidence. I work for a public institution. I work for the state of Ohio. I work for every one of you in this room who pay taxes in the state. And as a public institution, we have an accountability to the taxpayers. And part of that accountability is to have some public confidence that we are doing our best work to elevate higher ed in the state of Ohio. And to be publicly confident, that means that everybody has to feel that they have a piece or a stake or some connection to Ohio State, right? As a part of the state, whether that's your child has gone there or you feel confident in our abilities to win the women's basketball, woohoo, NCAA tournament. Y'all got to watch the women. But we have to have public confidence, and representation helps us to get there.
So before Derek weighs in, if you do have questions, please start making your way to the microphone. Please remember to keep your mask on as you're asking your questions, and keep your questions to a minute, please. So Derek, what's your reflection on the confirmation?
So I think there's two things. I'm happy, Wendy, you mentioned Nixon.
Derek, come closer to the mic.
I'm happy you mentioned Nixon. It's the only time I would be happy you mentioned Reagan, sorry. Yes. I'm happy you mentioned him because one of the things that it did was Joe Biden said black in front of women. Mm-hmm. Reagan did the exact same thing, but it was understood that it was white. Mm-hmm. Right? And so like we have to acknowledge that oftentimes we do things and there is one understood identity that we don't name, but it's still present. Right. The second part, though, is that, Marlon, you mentioned that Judge Brown Jackson was resilient. And I think one of the things that I struggle with in DE&I work, anytime you tell me that it is wonderful to acknowledge that someone has been resilient. It is problematic when they have to be. Because it means that the system was designed in a way that caused them harm that they had to withstand to exist. So yes, she was resilient, but she was resilient because the system was structured in a way that ensured that she had not likely to have been there otherwise. And that to me tells me when we have a problem. When you, right, like Ohio State, we talk about the students of color being resilient. We talk about the low-income students being resilient. Why? Because the system that we have in place was built in a way that did not mean for them to be there. And so they are fighting a system that was not planned for them. Certainly, when I think about the work that Wendy does or Cynthia Turner do as diversity or chief diversity officers of their respective colleges, they are trying to change the ways in which we think about that. But the moment someone has to be resilient to get something that they were uber qualified for, we are the problem. And we can always talk about the ways in which people show up in systems, but remember, when you have to persevere, when you have to be resilient, that means that the system wasn't built with you in mind, and that means we still have work to do to change the system so that you're included.
Yeah, I think all of these are really, really important points. The other thing that for me is representation on the panel, right? And so had Corey not delivered the speech that he delivered, right? To, essentially send her a message, right? Like, I got you, like, somebody here is, like rooting for you, right? You think about how lonely this confirmation hearing could have potentially been for her. And I know that one of the things that we think about is the interview panel representative of the candidates that are coming in the door?
Right. And
please.
As you say that, when you think about the panel, if you looked at our senators, did you look at the people who were sitting behind them? Right? Because the reality is the senators didn't write the questions. Corey clearly had his off of his head. But the senators don't write the questions. Their staff do. And when you looked at one side of the aisle, their staff was almost exclusively white and male. On that side of the aisle, there was also only one senator. It was a woman. right? And so I think when we talk about interviews, it's not just who's in the room, but it's who they're meant to be representing in the room.
Yeah.
Because we got to see the people behind the people on the panel.
Absolutely.
Oftentimes in interviews, you don't get to see who the rest is, right? Because we often will build a diverse panel, and then you learn that, oh, you met all the black people in the interview. Right. That was it.
Right.
And I was like, wait.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Well, since I don't see anybody coming to the microphone, I will take a point of privilege because my AALA Academy folks did send a question, and the question is, how to help people, so generally people of color in organizations who get tapped to do DE&I work just because they're the person of color in the organization. Go ahead, Derek.
Pay them. So first and foremost, right, like it's one thing to be the chief diversity officer or to elect to be in diversity, equity, and inclusion work. It's something else to have a full-time job and then be like, Melissa, wonderful black woman, I know that you know diversity, equity, and inclusion simply because of who you are.
I'm in accounting, Derek. I don't know.
Yes, but you clearly can run DEI. And the reality is Melissa may have an interest. She may have knowledge. But there are two things that you need to do. You need to pay her above and beyond what her job is because she's doing extra work. And second, you need to ensure that if she wants to take on that role, she has the support. And I don't mean like, good job, Melissa, I support you. I mean like the resources to engage in the work, whether that means training or the political and social capital of the leader she's representing.
Yeah. What would you say?
Ditto. And you know what so this happens really too often. And what I say, what I might say to the leader, senior leader, I say, if your company is currently in the red, like you're having a fiscal problem, do you go to marketing and ask them how to write the budget?
Some do.
Like, do you go to like the custodial staff and be like, can you help us with this budget situation? No, you probably call somebody who's an expert in finance. You probably call somebody who is an expert in that area. And they're like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So why are you talking to Keisha in accounting about your DEI plan? Like, why are you doing it? That sounds crazy. And they're like, oh, well, when you say it like that, well, yes. And so now that doesn't mean that Keisha in accounting has not done DEI strategy in her nonprofit she's on the board of. But did you find that out first? Like, did you find out if that's a skill she actually has? And just because someone knows something doesn't mean they know how to implement that, right? Like every great football player isn't a great coach, right? Just because every great mathematician isn't a great math teacher. So just because you might know something doesn't mean you know how to teach it, and you don't necessarily know how to operationalize it in your space. So we don't ask good questions, and we don't find out who is capable of doing what we need. And are we even articulating what we actually need? Or are you just saying, oh, people are saying we should do like a race thing. So hey, Wendy, you kind of look like you got some race in you. Like, can you do this race thing? And it's like, so you can check the box.
Do you have a question?
Yes, I do have a question, but I also have to say on behalf of all the Keishas in accounting who I used to be Keisha in change management, so I get it. Run me my money. But I'm Cherise Sledge-Thomas, and I'm responsible for diversity, equity, inclusion, and access at the Columbus Chamber of Commerce. And one of the things that I'm seeing as I'm meeting with employers is that we have this thing called feedback. So when you said that, Dr. Crum, I was like, yes. Here's the deal. Now that we're open and we're talking about racism and all of these things, I'm also seeing the flip side. And the flip side is that if your leader gives you feedback, you say, oh, you know what, I think they're racist. Or there's other things that come up in those conversations that are tied to racism. What I'm wondering, is there any trauma-informed feedback approach that we can begin teaching our leaders so that that doesn't continue to happen and Keisha in accounting can rise to the top?
Absolutely, it's a great question. Wendy, you want to start? go ahead, Melissa.
Let's talk about feedback.
Feedback. Need training on it. So I think what I found to be most successful, if you tie whatever your feedback is to a behavior that they're already clear that they're supposed to do, and whatever metrics they're supposed to be measured by, and whatever your organization or company values are. So you can say our value is X, your behavior, that your expectations are these are the ways in which you have not met these expectations. And also, do you have a workplace mindset that's closer to a growth mindset than more so a fix? So being able to say, okay, you didn't meet these expectations, what are the learning opportunities there, and then what do you need from me to support you to meet those expectations? So what I find is when folks are like, ooh, I feel like my boss is racist when we had this feedback, because they give you these vague things like, well, you're not a team player. Well, what does that mean? Like, what? Give me an example. Well, I just feel like you're not meshing with the. What does that mean? And point to something that I did. And when they can't point to something, then you end up where there's a lack of information. You make up a story. Not to say that story is right or wrong, but when you're just like, you're not a team player, we feel like, when you say stuff like we feel like you're this, or we da-da-da-da, then you're like, well, I don't understand. And so then then what we end up doing is not being objective. And then you to leave that room not knowing what you need to actually do. And so I think we got to be more clear about what we mean and what we want that person to need help with.
Well, and the other thing that I would add to that, too, is, we need leaders who are being introspective as well, right? And so, one of the things that we talk about is doing the switch. So if I'm giving Melissa this feedback, right? If John, her white counterpart, was doing the very same thing, let me do the switch. Would I be giving him that same feedback? And if I wouldn't, right, then there's some things that I might need to impact, right? Because what I heard in your question was that the employee, regardless of how good the feedback might be, the employee was still internalizing the behaviors that you're showing up every day feel racist to me, right? And so, having a leader who's introspective, who can say, is there some bias, right, in how I'm delivering this feedback? Are there some things that I need to unpack, when I'm giving Melissa the feedback, I think starts to break down some of those silos.
Linda is aggressive, where John is assertive.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think part of that too, though, is we have to educate, because everybody in the course of giving feedback doesn't understand or see how their bias can infiltrate that process. So while it occurs, it's important, just like we would do any other feedback loop or channels, to help them understand where they could be making potential mistakes, because it happens all the time, unfortunately.
Exactly. You have a question?
Yes. Hi, my name is Pam O'Loughlin, and I'm a teaching artist, and I'm just happy to be here. You guys have been awesome. I have two things that I'd like you guys to talk about. One of the things, Albert Einstein said that racism is a disease, and I think, like, when we're talking about diseases, the intersectionality, like, I think ageism and sexism and all of it is a disease. And not everybody, like, everybody has cancer in their body, but not everybody expresses it, if you eat right, if you're doing the right things. So I think that, like, racism or homophobia or whatever can be in us, but if we're doing those things that help us. So and my second thing is, I haven't heard a lot about, like, relationship. And the biggest thing I have in my head when I was sitting there is in the book Cast, her last story where she talks about the plumber coming in and just sharing that story of both having lost their moms, I think, right? And how that kind of drop down those fences, and I think how relationship is important, and if you guys could talk on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would say, so I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the things I think about when I think about intersectionality is the various dimensions of diversity. So when I'm thinking about the various dimensions of diversity, whether you are identified with age, sex, gender, religious preference, marital status, parental status, what you're ultimately saying is there's so much more to me than you can see. And here's an opportunity to get to know me in a way that you may not have traditionally known me. And so are you willing to do that? And when we are, we can build relationships that are so long-standing. One of the things that I remember from my time in corporate America was being a single black man. It was almost, I'm sorry, not a single black man, but a black man with no kids. At my age, no kids, black man, what's wrong with you? Or there was always the conversations, you know, in some instances about spring break. Well, I don't have any kids and we're not taking the trip. So oftentimes I felt excluded from conversations. And it wasn't until somebody noticed that I was very quiet around the spring break conversation that a white male came up to me and said, hey, everything okay? And I said, yes and no. I'm just uncomfortable because I don't have the spring break stories because I don't have kids. What ultimately came from that is a 8-year relationship with the senior executive where I've learned so much from him and he from me, so much so that he went to visit my hometown in Cleveland to get to know me, my family, how I grew up, the things that mattered to me. And I say all of that to say, all because he could see that those different dimensions of diversity didn't align with everyone else, that triggers something for him, which I think is important for allies, to think about how we can get to know one another in ways that are different than what we can see. I think the more all of us do that, the more we begin to build those relationships that I think will make a difference.
Please.
So, well, first I want to say when you mentioned like racism as a disease and all the other isms, I think it's important for us to realize that we are, like many of us have been socialized in some kind of way, oftentimes towards ideas of normal, quote unquote normal, meaning Christian, heterosexual, white, middle class, able-bodied, citizen, English speaking, all of those things. And anybody who has fewer of those identities, we almost don't know what to do with them. We don't know how to think about them. Like if you have too many complexities, too many intersections, like you are in a wheelchair and you're a woman and you're a lesbian and you're a person of color. This is too many things at one time. So thinking about how are we ensuring that we are aware of the way in which we are socialized so that we can undo some of those things that we might have been taught indirectly or directly. And sometimes we don't know that until we're intentional about digging into those identities. I think the other part about relationships when it comes to employment in organizations, disproportionately, it requires whoever's marginalized to make the effort to be in relationship with people in power. I rarely hear that story. It's like you had to make an effort to get to the VP's office so he could see you, so then you could be thought about for the next promotion, right? As opposed to there be a system of clear succession. And that's part of DEI work, to think about, okay, we already have time set aside to look at who's already stated to their manager that they're interested in rising in the ranks. Who are we already thinking about, okay, Wendy needs this training because she says she wants to be dean, and Derek wants to be, you know, whatever the next level is. So are we planning those things out? So Derek doesn't have to come find me, does it have to come and be my friend so that I can then see him to move him forward. And so what we don't think about is, I'm not saying we shouldn't have relationships, but too often it requires that extroverted person to make that extra effort to be seen, when there should be a system in place that sees them already.
You have a question? Please.
Hi. First off, I just wanted to thank you guys so much for everything that you said. I thought it was really well spoken, and I just appreciate the representation. I am currently a high school student. I go to a school that was advertised to be a safe space for students, but this is America and we're in Ohio, so of course it's not going to be like perfectly safe for everyone.
Not from the babies.
Yeah. So I am a Black queer woman of color with mental disabilities. So, and I've also lived in Asia, so I've had a lot of experiences around the world with just how to navigate real life. And at our school, we have a lot of problems with racism because our founder of our school created this space to specifically be a safe space for queer white students, but it is not a safe space for people of color or people with disabilities. So I am currently in the Justice, why am I forgetting this? It's the Justice Club, and currently we are planning on doing a seminar where we sit all the teachers down and students from different minorities come up and speak about their experiences and how to deal with certain situations. Now, we're having a problem with how we want to go about this. A lot of the white students are like, oh, we need to be nice. We should make them a Google Slides presentation and send them links. And all the black students are like, no, let's go. Like, it's senior year. We need to mic drop, get our diplomas, and leave. Like, they need to know that they're in the wrong. So what would your recommendation be for our club to do? Do you think we should reach out to people, like adults in our community? Do you think we should leave it just to the students? Because a lot of students, we don't want to do the person who is running the pod because it's a white heterosexual man. He's not going to understand what we're talking about. So what do you think would be the best way to go about going through with this?
So who'd like to start?
First off, I am feeling so comforted with the future. To hear you articulate things that it has taken me, so many years to understand and to bring voice to, I am exceedingly hopeful in this moment of hearing you speak. One of the things that I would say is that, and this is for us to think about as an audience together, context always matters, right? So in some ways, it's very challenging for me to be able to say, you all should do the following, right? Because I don't have a lot of the intel around the context, right, that you're dealing in the space that you're dealing in. What I would say is that the core part of the mission of the space is education, right? So operating from this space that everyone has something to learn in this moment and figuring out how do we all own that we have something to learn in the space, and kind of starting from that point, I think is a really great kind of common space, because I'm also in education. That's one of the go-tos for us, is to kind of think about what's learning, what's the learning piece, right? What's the outcome? What's the learning outcome that we really want? And how can we grow in that kind of growth and learning mindset, right? And then I'll let some of our kind of top facilitators get into this space and kind of talk about, one-to-one tactics. But coming out of this space that everybody has something to learn, and I think all of us can think about that. And that goes back to your earlier, question. We can't think about DEI as something that's one and done, or things that we can do for a little while. We can read one book, everybody come to one book club, and we're done. But it's a book series, right? Such that we're constantly engaging and bridging to new understandings of other kinds of inequalities that arise in our organizations, in our communities. And I'm gonna move it to our facilitators who can tell you what to put on the whiteboard.
Well, one thing I was thinking when you were talking too is getting clear about what wildly successful will look like to you. So when everything is said and done, if you were to look back on the session and say that was wildly successful, what would it look like for you? How will you feel? How will your peers of color feel? And how will the organization be different? And then build back from there. And so if that means PowerPoints, right? Like PowerPoints are going to drive that, then that's what you would have. But if it means pull up, like you said, then, how do you build that? But at the end of the day, it has to be the thing that is going to make you feel like this was wildly successful. You need to center yourself and your peers in the moment, right? And then build it around that.
So I would say, yes, that. Then I would call the strategic part is to find a champion in a position of power. You got to find out who that is. So who is the person who can move rooms when you're not there? When the Justice Club is not present, who can speak for you? Who can speak with you, right? When in those rooms you can't be, and figuring out who that person is. It might be a principal, it might be somebody else. You don't know. Well, I don't know. You have to find that out. I would say second is whatever that wildly success looks like, connected to the values that the school says that they uphold. So you should be able to say, well, we want this, and it connects to this value that you said you believe in, right? And always connected to use their words. So whether it's their mission, their values, their vision statement, whatever, always make that direct connection. So they're saying whatever you're proposing is actually uplifting what they say they're supposed to do. So in a way, you're couching it as, I'm helping you be who you say you think you are, right? And then that shifts the conversation. The other thing is when you have your goals and outcomes, think about what does that look like for the people in that space. So what does it look like for teachers? What does it look like for the teacher's assistants? What does it look like for the PE coach? Like who does it look like? And that's going to be helpful when you gather those stories from your colleagues, from your colleagues. Well, colleagues, we'll go with it. And then lastly, I would connect your behaviors to any data you can find, and that's where you want to get that external partner. So for example, there was this research a while ago that came out of Harvard. They went to this school and they were like, we're going to give you this great, we're going to give your school this great test. It's going to find out if everybody, who's going to have this IQ bloom, that there's going to be these geniuses. We're going to give them this special test. And they gave them all this special test. The school, they made up a list. They just randomly picked some kids and say, these are the kids that's going to have this bloom. And what the intention of the study was to see how the teachers treated the kids that was on this list versus the ones who were not on the list. And the way they treated the students who were on the list, they gave them more clear feedback. They gave them more like good jobs. They gave more affirming things. Now these were kids who were all different kinds of races, incomes, everything. And what they found was, and that special test was just an IQ test. It was just a regular test. And what they found is after this long period of time, these kids that were on this made-up list, all their IQs and grades went up. So when you're saying, let's say the examples that you all are experiencing that is the teachers don't call on me, the teachers aren't telling me what I did wrong, the teachers aren't helping me, aren't telling me where the tutoring opportunities are, things like that. Well, you can say, well, there's research that demonstrates how things like classism or sexism or racism are showing up, and we can say how we are experiencing the thing that's in this research paper. And so figuring out what external partners can help you validate, I want to say validate because it's not invalid, but to confirm, to further push what you're already experiencing, to say that we aren't just out here just talking just to be talking. Like this is something that's continuing to show up.
And I think we have time for, do both of you have questions? Two last questions.
And Kiana, can I just give one tactical example really quick?
Yep.
So first of all, thank you for your courage to speak on this topic. Really quick, what I've seen work is to get individuals in the room, all of those stakeholders that you want to hear what it is you all have to say. Think of 3 questions that align with the themes that you want to address, whether it's ability status, racism, generational differences, whatever that is. Think of those 3 questions, get everyone in the room, and have everyone spend time answering one or all of those 3 questions. What that does is it creates an opportunity for you all to be heard and for people to receive what it is you have to say. And just one other point, make sure there's someone in the room that's going to facilitate that discussion, because it can get very rough, tough, unfortunately disrespectful, and someone has to be able to support you all through that. But good luck to you.
Yes, sir.
In terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, do you feel that sequentially maybe we need to talk more about equity before we even start talking about diversity and inclusion? So I just wanted to get some response from you on that, whether, and strategically, I think about 2 presidents that were at Ohio State, Dr. Anderson and Dr. Jennings. And Anderson, I know I'm dating myself, but Anderson was real philosophical, and he continually brought the university to the conversation of race. Jennings was a finance guy, and I say this in terms of promoting self-interest from a power standpoint. And Jennings said, I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but what I am going to do is every dean, and I guess this was my experience while I was there, every dean, 8 to 12% of your personal compensation is going to be based upon recruitment and matriculation. And his numbers were great, but some people would argue about sustainability. But it was a very quantitative remedy. And I guess I just wanted to get some response to you about those words, what we prioritize in terms of equity and remedy, and maybe our sequence could be different.
Absolutely. So in the interest of time, I'm going to ask one person to respond. So Derek.
How'd you choose the one person, Kiana?
What's the rubric?
I certainly think it is possible to privilege one over the other. I think you run the risk potentially, though, of creating an equitable environment that is non-inclusive or non-diverse. And what I mean is, right, we can get better at treating and dealing with the folks who are here, right? We can reconcile that. And then we still are not ready or able to invite new people in and be equitable at the same time. And so I think certainly if I had to choose, I can only do one, I'm going to shoot for equity. That is where I will go. But when you give people the option of doing one or the other, it somehow always tends to fall back into the space of privileging the people who are privileged. And so I would hesitate against centering one over the other.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Derek. Please.
I work with a lot of youth, and my question is going to be how much of the inclusion and diversity is kind of you think might be self-inflicted from ourselves, right? Like a lot of us point the fingers a lot of times, and we don't even step into those realms of saying, hey, I want to be included, or even take the steps to just be there. We stand from the back and point the finger, like I said, as that. And I'm finding just when I'm working with youth, I don't even care about that, and things of that. And so just a little bit about like us fighting for this space and just, like you said, the future and steps we can make to make sure that the younger ones actually want to be there. And just, like I said, just, I know a lot of, drugs and all that stuff kind of, made us into this space. But, I'm just speaking a little bit into that and what you guys think about that.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Wendy?
Thank you. This question, we talked a little bit about bias, and we tend to think about bias as being only for the privileged to have, right? But we often come into spaces with our own biases. So when we talk about how we receive feedback, they hating on me, right? But you might have some hateable behaviors, right? So are you getting, we have to ask some questions about those times in which we're getting in our own way, or that we do not open ourselves for vulnerability. Because there are those times when you can amazingly find that ally, right, who says, I want to know more about your experience. And here's the thing that out of this kind of post-Breonna Taylor, George Floyd moment, it's a whole lot of hype people who are, just, I want to know how I can help. But you also have people who genuinely are trying to find their voice and figure out, what can I contribute to changing the trajectory of the moment in which we're in, where we can actually be human together, right? And we have to sometimes be vulnerable to allow ourselves to experience those people. Now, when I say be vulnerable, I didn't say be stupid, right? So there are some spidey senses, there's some internal things that you feel about an interaction. But at some point, we do have to be vulnerable to open ourselves to possibilities and address our own biases that all the folks are the man and they hating on, whatever. And there's some ways that we can accept people into our lives who are different from us and who can bring something of admiration in our spaces.
Yeah. So we obviously could continue this conversation all night, another hour. It has been fruitful. It has been rich. Please join me in thanking the panelists. And I'm going to invite Susan back up to the microphone to close us out for the evening.
I just want to say, in the words of what Marlon said, what a qualified facilitators and speakers to have here at the Lincoln on the stage. The Lincoln appreciates you saying yes to this topic and being here and sharing with us your areas of study and your expertise and encouraging the young lady here. We've had the pleasure to have her talent here at our summer camp and also with our Renaissance Magic year in 2018, so it's good to see you back, Jasmine. On that point, we are providing scholarships in your names to 5 young campers here for this year. Yes. So thank you. So in that spirit of giving back and in that spirit of support, and also knowing that the Lincoln is more than just a theater. It's a conversation place. It's a place where we create, a place where we host. It's community, and we fight every day to make sure that that essence is here in our community and in our building. So again, thank you for staying so long. It was wonderful. Thank you for all the questions and our staff that is here, and also our board members who are here to support. So on behalf of all of them, we thank you again. Thank you and good night.